for e-learning platforms. But for the rest of the ordinary people who have been working physically and now have to shift and to start working online, nothing much has been done. Although even the regulators provided for, the extra allocation of spectrum, it was not done with the ordinary worker in mind. So already we are seeing that for workers that were low-level income earners, they are still going to be prejudiced because they need to continue undertaking their work, but now they have extra costs of ensuring that, they access the internet and they undertake the work that they were doing offline, but now doing it online. And although we've seen some institutions, around the countries providing for, some allowances for internet access, it's not all institutions that have had the capacity to do that. Also because businesses have been affected due to the COVID-19 pandemic and the regulations that ensued from that. So really from an ordinary worker perspective, there's so much that needs to be done. The government might need to intervene to ensure that consideration is also placed on people that need to continue undertaking their work and their businesses online, despite the pandemic. And then now when we look at issues of the Universal Services Fund, indeed, there's not been much communication even by the regulators or the administrators of those funds. From what we have seen, there are reports, but these are reports that were, from 2018, 2019, or at the earliest stages when these funds were introduced. But to date, there are no updated reports even on the websites. So it's also another issue of ensuring that we deliberately request information from the administrators of these funds to say, okay, what did you do from this period to this period, or what has been done in 2021 to ensure that people have access to the internet or to promote the purposes of the fund. But also I've seen in South Africa, but also even in Zimbabwe, establishment of community networks. So I think that's another avenue that civil society can use, to probe the administrators of the Universal Services Fund to also work together, with organizations that are spearheading the establishment of these community networks to see also how best they can contribute to those. I know Internet Society, the Zimbabwean chapter, has been doing lots of work around that, but also even Mr. Zimbabwe has been doing establishing some information hubs and the likes, but there's a need to promote a partnership because the government or the administrators of the funds already have access even to the telecommunication industry players. They could get the telecommunication industry players to commit to providing bandwidth to some of these communities. They can even channel some of their funds under the Universal Services Fund to support established community networks or to support information hubs with internet access. So I think the opportunity would be for partnership, probing the government to partner with the efforts of CSOs that are already trying to bridge the gap around, the location divide for rural and marginalized communities. Right. And for countries that have done well, South Africa is a very good example in terms of the inclusive Internet Index. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you so much. I don't know if there's anyone of the participants who has a contribution relating to that. No, Poncelet, I hope that you answered. And I would like us to move on. And our next speaker is going to be looking at gender equality and marginal communities. Patricia Nyasuna is the program officer under the Gender and ICT Policy Advocacy Program at the Women of Uganda Network. So like I said, all the speakers that are on this panel today are actually representatives of members of the AFDEC coalition. So it's over to you, Patricia.
Thank you so much, Koliwe, and thank you so much, Nampilo. I've really loved your presentation and it adds a lot on what I wanted to say. So I would request to turn off my video. I feel it's affecting the way I'm listening to other participants. If it's fine, Koliwe, as I go on.
Yes, it's fine. You can move on.
Hello?
You can go ahead.
Okay, thank you so much. So before I even start speaking about gender inequality and marginalized communities, I would really like to appreciate this opportunity by APC for hosting this and bringing all of us together as coalition members to be able to share updates and also to inform each other and also participants who are all playing a key role in ensuring that we are all able to use the online space very well. So before we even start, you cannot speak about the issue of gender equality or even marginalized groups without talking about access. That's why I think it was really structured well that we started with Nampilo, who gave a very, very good insight on access. At some point, she even talked about the issues when it comes to gender equality. So for me, I would really like to say that looking at not only equality in form of equal rights, but also equal access, equal use, you know, and the ease of women to be able, as well as men, to access services, to access resources is very, very key when it comes to talking about digital rights in Africa. So we should all know by now that access to the internet plays a very, very vital role. A vital role in the full realization of human rights and also facilitating the actual enjoyment of other human rights and freedoms. For example, freedom to expression, rights to education, economic development, a number of rights that are supposed to be enjoyed by men and women equally. So when we go back to the gender digital divide, which again Nampilo also spoke about, it's nice she hinted on that. It makes my presentation quite easier. You realize that half of the entire globe, 52% of women are not actually using the internet. You see, so Africa still has the widest digital gender gap, which is over 18.6% women using the internet compared to 24.1% of men. You see how wide that gap is, you know? And why does this happen? It's because of issues like the high illiteracy levels, high cost of the internet, digital illiteracy, and also some of the structural patriarchal norms that keep women in certain spaces that limit their actual contribution to digital development or even to the continuous development of different sectors, you know? So when we look at coming to the COVID-19 context right now, I would just give an example of in Uganda, the first lockdown happened around March last year, 2020 March. So based on our work as WhoopNet, because there was a lot of realization of issues of gender-based violence, or I would say domestic violence, we also saw that the uptake in the use of internet or the use of different technologies was sprouting. It was going very high, meaning now everyone was getting onto this one space, you know. We have women who have been doing business, but now we were limited because of the COVID-19. So we're all moving into this online space, you know, and everyone wants to survive. So how does your mom asks you, I want to learn how to do digital marketing so that my tomatoes go out, they do not die. You know, the teachers on these ends are asking still, how do I learn how to be able to do a coaching for students in school? And some of these people are, I would like to look at it as some of them are women who already hadn't attained a certain level of education. So they are not really good with these tools, but here they are to something, you know, new, but we have to catch up because what? We have to survive, you know? So WhoopNet conducted a study, a simple survey where we were trying to look at the issue of online gender-based violence. It is something that came out key because as the government and other actors were looking at the sprouting violence against women, the other forms of violence which are not online, we felt that look at this space, you know, everyone is getting into it. We have now young girls, children getting onto that space because of digital, they're supposed to learn online, you know. So everyone is here. Are the girls safe? are there certain issues that probably are happening that we are not able to address because right now the focus is on the disease, our health, and then also probably fear of what is going to happen tomorrow. But here was the internet, and the good thing was that when we did this study, we actually found out that 50% of the women and girls who participated in this survey had either experienced online gender-based violence, or they had heard from a friend, or they had listened to a situation on TV, on the radio, or watched it on a TV show, or even social media. So this alone was enough for us to think through, and we wrote a report to the Special Rapporteur on Violence Against Women for the UN. I will share it on the chat here so that we can click the link and get more information about that. And from that specific study, we were able to find grounds on now how exactly do we integrate issues of online GBV, and also ensuring that still women are able to grow in the online space and not run away from it, because it is abuse that is happening. But should we run away so that we find solutions? No. What do? We stay on the space and we see how best we can work to be able to catch up. Then maybe still on the COVID-19 situation, you see, when you look at gender equality and you look at women as a marginalized group, women are not a homogeneous group, So we are going to look at women PWDs, for example. We are going to look at women in the rural areas, for example. We are going to look at young girls in the university, We are going to look at students. Probably that would be maybe I would say from the age of 17 to 12 years who are in high school and now have to use the online space. So each category of those people has different challenges, has different perspectives in the way they are going to use the internet or this specific space. And us as an organization, or as even the entire coalition, how did we come in to ensure that every group, with their different needs or with their different situation, is still able to contribute to development and keep going on regardless of of this pandemic. So apart from only this, then another problem, sorry, not a problem, but an issue that would have come out a lot was the issue of digital literacy. Now, when you do not have the skills, how are you going to use the internet? And even then, are you going to be able to exercise your digital rights, as a woman, for example, in Africa? No. So when as an organization, as Women of Uganda Network, we also took the mandate to conduct digital security trainings or digital security skilling for women. So I just want to share a simple story that we did with of an experience that I went through learning this. So going through school, that's before COVID, and right now, it's not a long time from now, but as you're in gender class and they're teaching you probably about issues, things that affect women from using the online space or women being online, people would come up with issues like high illiteracy, the cost of the internet, digital literacy, but there's also an issue of technophobia. Now, for me individually as a person, I found it queer, how can someone fear something that is supposed to actually help them? But these issues are very, very real. In the digital security trainings that we have been conducting, and in the different engagements with women and girls, still looking at these different groups, you'll talk to a university student and she will say, if I know these things too much, the boys will think I'm too good, so let me downplay a little. Girls are actually downplaying themselves because they are afraid of discrimination on the online platform. this is something that may seem a bit peculiar to someone, but it is true. Then also the rural woman is really afraid of using her mobile phone. You know, she feels she may spoil it. She wants the husband maybe to do what, to support that. So we as CSOs, we as the government, we as different actors with different interests in making the internet or the online space good for women and girls, as well as other marginalized groups, how do we come in to support this? So I would just give, before I give some of the recommendations, in one of our engagements with Uganda Women Parliamentary Association, that is UWOPA, one of the key issues that was brought about was the fact that civil society organizations need to work together with the government, especially women parliamentarians, because they tend to ignore the issues of online gender-based violence and focus more on the physical violence. And yet online gender-based violence is actually affecting women's participation or being part of the online space. Previously in Uganda, we elected a new cabinet and majority of the ministers were women. So there was a lot of information that was a bit negative, and many people were saying the women were picked just because they were women, you know. It was a lot online. Women's documents were being played. She didn't reach this level, she didn't manage to achieve as much, so he's just giving her position because she is a woman. There was a lot of online gender-based violence, and I think this is when now the women parliamentarians actually realize, wow, so this online space can really reduce, this online space can really affect our work, you know, and our productivity and us being visible as women. And from this very engagements and things that WOOGNET has worked with the team and also other women organizations, as well as support from the coalition, APC, and also the Digital Human Rights Lab, we've been able to put out information, you know, as an organization. How do we continue doing research? How do we put out information that is not only disaggregated in different forms, but which is specifically sex disaggregated, you know, to be able to have the issues affecting the men as well as those affecting the women, and how many women are affected vis-a-vis the number of men that are affected. So in a previous study again that we have done during this COVID pandemic, during the timing this very year, early in June 2021, with support from Digital Human Rights Lab, we did a nationwide research on the types, the spread, and the impact of online gender-based violence on women's rights online. And from this, again, we discovered that the women who are more at risk are the women celebrities, the women musicians, women university students, women politicians, and women journalists. So even as a coalition, as we continue to do research, as we continue to make to work towards improving the internet as a digital space to be used by both men and women in rightful ways, these key groups are very important in our efforts and in the way that we do our forms of facilitation on the same. So just a few recommendations would be: one, to enhance the ability of the police and the judiciary to fight online gender-based violence through trainings and capacity building. Because still in these different endeavors, especially during this COVID-19 timing, we have seen that most of the law enforcers are aware of online gender-based violence, but they do not know what exactly are the issues and how do we be able to, how do we address them? How do we look at victims, for example? How do we be gender sensitive, you know? Because gender sensitivity doesn't only come in other aspects, but it's also very important online and when we are looking at issues that affect women and men separately. Then also the media creates a very big, they have a very big command of community attention, and the way that they bring out information that affects that is faced by women and men affects a lot of times the way that the community will respond or engage. For example, this issue I'm talking about, the women parliamentarians that were double questioned and double checked and double everything simply because they are women, you know, and this was being done online, you know, and some of them even thought maybe people just have to talk, but we can actually report this, because how does someone get your documentation online? So I feel like also the media should strive to inform and educate and also mobilize the public to respect and promote women's rights online. Also, as CSOs, we need to build stronger multi-stakeholder coalitions. I think Nampilo spoke about this. It's very, very, very important as well. And then also continue to produce sex disaggregated data. It is very important to have sex disaggregated data that enables us to have information that not only targets one group, but we do not leave the other group of women behind. And also for the marginalized groups, if we are looking at PWDs, if we are looking at women sex workers, if we are looking at probably the LBT, let us be specific, you know, in research and not just generalize. These are women, these are men. No, let's also try to look into the nitty-gritties and also interest members of parliament in issues of gender and technology, and the fact that the fact that technology is a trend that is going on, and at the end of the day, we shall all have to be on these online platforms. And if we are saying there is abuse online, it should be looked at right from the onset, not waiting for something to turn physical, you know? So I feel like research alone is not enough, and organizations should continue to sensitize and train communities on the meaningful use of ICT-enabled tools so that we leave no one behind. Let's really try to go on with the sustainable development goals and leave no woman behind. So based on that, I think that is all I can share for now. Back to you, Koliwe. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that, Patricia. Really, really insightful. For me, I think the highlight of your presentation was the issue that you raised on technophobia. So I think that technophobia actually comes naturally in senior women. And I'm saying this as a woman who works in tech, but I still have to call my son to hook me up with the Spotify app to make sure that I'm paying on time, to explain to me why this and this is happening. So I'm really glad that you raised that issue on technophobia. I'm also seeing the links that you provided in terms of the aspects of digital literacy, which Nompilo as well spoke to. And I think that this is something that we should really come out of this conversation clear about. And I would like to hear from even all the other panelists, whose responsibility is it? When we start talking about digital literacy programs at community level, do we have any examples of best practice and just the linkages? Because one of the issues that Patricia has just raised is the issue of the relationship, the adversarial relationship between governments and civil society. So how best can we start working around realistic digital literacy programs? Then the last thing I'll point out is your very important issue on sex disaggregated data. And I think one of the issues that we probably want to highlight is the importance of having this data in especially the quarterly reports that we receive from the regulators when they update on the telecom sector in terms of how many people are connected. We don't get that data, and this is something that we might want to consider. The first question that we have, I can see your hand is up, Wendy, I'll get to you. The first question is from Roslyn, that you can think about Patricia as Wendy gives us her intervention, is just a little bit of elaboration on the target group of the survey that you made reference to earlier. So I think this would probably be just in terms of who exactly did you target among the gender and marginal groups that you made reference to. Over to you, Wendy.
Thanks, Koliwe, and thank you so much, Patricia, for that very informative talk. Mine is kind of a mix of a question and a comment. This is not my area of expertise, so very interested to hear more from you, Patricia. And I agree with you, Kaliwe, about what you said with regards to digital literacy training, and we really need to get to a point where that's actually implemented now. It's spoken about a lot, but not necessarily implemented very well. But I do feel like I'm very interested in the big tech companies, and I feel like the big tech companies do like to provide digital literacy training. It's something that they do like to do, as opposed to more structural changes that kind of would have a more structural effect on women and other minorities and other marginalized people experiencing violence and prejudice and bias and other things online. So my question for you, Patricia, is what do you think that big tech companies need to do more of in order to change the environment structurally for these groups of people?
Thanks for that question, Wendy. Patricia, I'm handing back to you for the responses.
Okay, thank you so much. I think let me start with Rosalind's question about the target group. So in that specific survey that we did, it entailed 5 regions in Uganda, and we looked at university students. We also targeted women activists. Then also we targeted women who were working in different ICT departments, either university or in high school, whichever, women in tech, I would say. And then also we looked at women musicians. And yes, those were the target groups that we looked at in that study. Then maybe Wendy's question, I'm not sure I got it right, but I think she was talking about what best way can we work with the different groups, the different marginalized groups, in being able to ensure that they have digital literacy skills. Was it the one?
So her question was, what do you think the role of the tech sector, the big companies, should be in offering the digital literacy skills? Because I think in her outline, she says that she feels that they're a bit once off and not long term. So what do you think their role should be? Is that correct, Wendy?
Yes, I guess it's that, as well as a broader question around what should the tech companies be doing.
Okay, so let me answer that. I think one of the key things that the tech sector needs to do is to make technology really uptakeable, or people being really able to take up technology as something that develops or something that contributes to their development. We do not want to look at technology as something that is difficult, you know. Look at technology as something that is strange. And you see, as WOOCnet, we work a lot with the rural women. So it really becomes a problem if you even give her a camera and she says, let them add a man to this group so that we are able to work together because he will handle it better, you know? So if there is a way, we would just maybe have adverts that are really tailored towards the way that technology can really contribute, you know, to development. That would be something that would be very key. Then also as a sector, maybe they should do mass training, mass skilling, and not only doing these skillings for groups that they feel have already reached a certain level. You know, usually it's like they have a fear of working with people who have more needs compared to those who have already reached a certain level. So unless there may be they're partnering with a civil society organization that will say, okay, we shall start and reach it at this level. They fear a lot to go down to the grassroots, so they'd rather go to a school in the city, or children that are already illiterate to a certain level. So if they would break down that wall and just really start from down, I think it would really contribute a lot, especially when it comes to using digital technologies. And also continuous partnership, especially with the government, on resources that are available to be able to train, to be able to even provide, you know, just give people the tools and also teach them how best they can use them safely. Thank you so much.
Thanks for that. Nompilo, I'm going to give you 1 minute for your interaction so that we can move on to Tobegile. Over to you, Nompilo.
Thank you very much. Actually, Patricia has touched on what I meant to say in response to Wendy's question, that what we have noted is that big tech companies usually take a very high level approach. Even the conversations and the skills transfer engagements are more high level. So it's important to ride on the power of collaboration with people, the grassroots, the people on the ground, for a more bottom to top approach. I think that will go quite a long way. Because if we look, for instance, at issues of cyberbullying and harassment that we spoke to earlier, that Patricia also touched on, so many of these platforms have security features which women can benefit from. But most of the time, these women who are the ordinary internet users are not really aware of these features or how to navigate their way around the platform to promote their own safety on the platforms. So there's really a need to promote that bottom to top approach. Thank you.
Thanks for that. And also to just say thank you, Patricia, for that emphasis around the targeting of women. And I think it's very structured in that if you are an ordinary woman online and you see the levels of harassment or torture, just like that, people that you look at as community leaders or celebrities in your own context, then there are levels of censorship in terms of the extent to which we can engage. And I have also personally been in situations where some prominent woman is being attacked, and then I'm afraid, even though I'm a feminist activist, I am afraid to be part of the chastising of, these trolls, because you don't know which ones of your skeletons they are going to pull out of the closet. And I have many of those. Thank you. So the next speaker is Thobekile Matimbe, who works with Paradigm Initiative as the community manager. And she works around promoting digital rights in Africa, particularly with the Net Rights Coalition. And she's going to speak to us on the principle of the right to information, which is really great coming after the first two presentations, because I think they all relate or tie down to, people's access to information, their right to access it, and also in terms of how freely they would be to express themselves or participate in more broader national context. So over to you, Thobekile.
Thank you so much. It's been quite interesting just following these conversations, and I know Nampilo laid a good foundation, the number of illustrations in terms of what's going on in parts of Africa. And it's a pleasure to be here, and hi to everyone and the participants joining. I'm just going to just basically dive into principle 4, which is the right to information. Well, my approach basically is to just lay out why the right to information is important and critical, and obviously flag out some, key development, or just a few developments on the continent, as well as probably some of the challenges that are being faced, without overly repeating what has been already mentioned by the previous speakers. So just to start off with, I think for me, when I'm talking about the right to information and just picking from principle 4 of, these principles that we're discussing, basically the right to information, what we're saying is that people should be able to access information on the internet, and public bodies must be able to disclose information sufficiently so that people are able to understand what's going on, as well as to be able to also to protect their human rights, basically. So when we're looking at the right to information, we're saying that we're not talking about something peculiar, but we're talking about right to information on the internet as something very critical, especially when we're considering human rights. So basically, your government entities, the public bodies, or even private bodies that are obviously exercising a public function, have a duty to make sure that information is available. And when I think today, basically being obviously, a commemorative day where we're remembering universal access to information, it's very pertinent that we also touch on this aspect, that while we're discussing the right to information on the internet, we need to, recall what the theme of today is. And the theme for today basically is, the right to know and building back better. And we've just come out of a pandemic, and we've had a lot of things that have been going on, a lot of laws that have been promulgated around COVID-19. And the question that we need to be asking ourselves is, what has happened with the legislations that have been promulgated? Are they giving effect to access to information are they laying down the foundation for the right to information? And I remember, basically in Zimbabwe, there was an incident where, there was a lot of outcry from civil society to say, well, we don't have enough information in terms of the rollout of COVID-19 vaccinations and etc. What is going on? And government was not disclosing enough. So you find that when we're discussing or unpacking the right to information, we are considering whether government entities are giving us the adequate information, sufficient information. Is the maximum disclosure, basically, when we're looking at the principles that, that center, that this right to information. Very pertinent, very critical, especially when we're coming out of the pandemic. And it's said to say that a number of African countries have basically made this a health issue, but it's not only about one right. Rights are interrelated and interconnected. So when you're going to be promoting the right to health, for instance, with any mechanisms of contact tracing and the likes, you need to be able to also look, on the other hand, what is happening to disclosures of information, what is happening as well to the protection of personal data that is collected. So I think it's very critical that when we're looking at the right to information, we outline these principles. So one thing I like as well is that when we're looking at principle 4, the right to information, we are not talking about it in isolation. Yes, it's us as a coalition that are embracing this principle, but basically the foundation of this principle is centered in obviously Article 9 of the African Charter on Human and People's Rights, which basically outlines our right to access information as well as to receive information. So you can't sever freedom of expression from access to information. They kind of go hand in hand. But we're saying that even when we're looking at our governments, to what extent are they complying with Article 9 of the African Charter? And the African Commission has elaborated as well on the right to access to information, basically the right to information, and basically has outlined key principles, that needs to be complied with, and also aligning with principle 4, the right to information, basically outlining the need for maximum disclosure as well, as well as to proactively disclose information. So with the example I've given you of Zimbabwe, there's no need for governments to be probed to say what's going on, what's happening, what is the story with the rollout of vaccines, what about the marginalized communities, are they going to get access, what's going to happen? So that's a critical issue. And even in the rollout of technologies in terms of collection of information, what is going on, how much information is being stored, and for what purposes, etc., and what are the safeguards for personal data, without discussing much on personal data. But these are some of the critical issues that we see that are of critical importance. But today, like I said, again, I keep on hammering on this because I'm talking about the right to information, today's universal access to information day. So one of the critical things that has centered the theme of today is basically legislation. So for me today, it's critical that I emphasize the issue of legislation that we're having or we're not having. It's the repressive legislation that is there that kind of makes or breaks the right to information. And you'd find that we have a number of countries, obviously, on the continent that possibly don't have sufficient or adequate legislation that protects this right to information, or we've got bad legislation that basically does not provide for any oversight or judicial oversight on information or on denials of access to information. For instance, in Niger, as an example, you find that they have legislation that basically has been used in a number of ways to crack down on people, and denial of information just comes in and there's no judicial oversight. So what are the mechanisms that are there to ensure that when there are requests, for instance, for information, there's a safeguard so that people are able to access information? And if information that has been requested is not granted, there's no access that has been granted to it, what are the mechanisms in place? So it's something that as well we need to be on the lookout for, to monitor and see, okay, what legislation do we have? But most importantly, it's not only about access to information laws that are there, but they don't only operate in a vacuum. There's also a whole mirage, or rather what can I say, tons, right, of legislative provisions that are used outside of the traditional information laws that are used to crack down, for instance, on the media or human rights defenders, which stifle, access to information, basically. So, for instance, your cyber crime laws, that they're being used to stifle this. And I would like to focus again on Niger, where we have, a journalist to disclose something about corruption and misuse of funds by the Ministry of Defense, and the journalist was arrested. But basically what happens there is that you have a government that does not disclose information. You have a government that does not proactively disclose what's going on if there's been mismanagement of funds. And now when somebody else, the media, within the public interest, releases this information, all hell breaks loose, for lack of a better phrase. It breaks loose and journalists are attacked. We saw that with Hopo Chimono as well. But you see, there's critical information of public interest not being openly disclosed. So we've seen that. But we've got good news, basically, when countries do enact this, access to information laws or information laws legislation. It's something that we celebrate because it's a starting point. But obviously, we have to check against the model law we've got. For instance, in Africa, we've got the model law on access to information, which kind of stipulates this kind of principles, aligning with our principle 4. You look at Ghana in 2020, they released a piece of legislation, basically, which kind of, the Right to Information Act in May 2020. And you find that it kind of lays down the foundation for what should happen, etc. And when we look at Kenya as an illustration, they also came up with a commissioner, an independent commissioner, to be able to also give some form of assistance and oversight there, and that is very critical. But we've also have a number of bills which were enacted in 2020, as an example, Freedom of Information Bill in Zimbabwe, and you'd find that one of the contentious issues with that as well was around who has oversight. Should it be the Media Commission? Should it be the Zimbabwe Human Rights Commission? Who is more independent? But the issue here is we need to be able to check what government is doing with regards to information, because information is key, and we cannot let ourselves not get access to information. We need to know, we need to be able to protect ourselves. So specifically, when we're looking at the right to know on the internet, the question is, how do governments manage this information? What do they do with our information? And to what extent should they hold on to our information? And also, if they don't do their job, what should we do with people who proactively, on behalf of the nation or the citizenry, disclose information of public interest? So we also consider that aspect really of protective disclosures to say, okay, how can we protect those who at least release information? And again, we need to have legislation. So when we're looking, broadly speaking, at the right to information, basically what we're saying from my perspective is that we need legislative provisions that really give effect to this right. Bad legislation will break the right. Good legislation will make sure that citizens across the continent are able to enjoy access to information. And also, definitely, what we can say is that we need to be able to ensure and call our governments to check in terms of the information. Sometimes you go to our websites, there's no information. There's nothing. You try. I've had colleagues saying, what's going on? What's happening even with COVID-19? What's going on? They don't have recent statutory instruments. Then you have to go onto another civil society organization's platform to be able to access relevant information, because the government itself, for some strange reason, does not have this capacity. But we're saying on the internet, we need to be able to click and get information. I'll talk about, also the use of technology in making sure that information is readily available. I'll talk about GovChat in South Africa. I think they've been doing great, in case someone wants to ask. They've been doing great. I think GovChat is a good platform for interaction within the service delivery system, where you find that the community can be able to engage actively with the local, councils in terms of getting easy access to information and also raising queries. Though I do have concern in terms of the marginalized communities, to say to what extent do they have access to this platform, the internet, so that they're able to have enhanced access to information. So maximum disclosures, yes, we can talk about them on the internet as well, but we cannot talk about them in isolation of this big elephant in the room, which big elephant has to do with access. When we have people who are excluded, the majority, we are online here because we are the privileged, we have access to each other, and despite the pandemic, what about those who are marginalized? So whatever rollout plans that the government has in terms of enhancing access to information, using technology, the internet, etc., it must never forget that there's a whole lot of people who are marginalized. So what is the plan for those people as well? So I think that is what I can say. I do know that time is going, so I'm just going to just basically leave it here. But basically, as a recommendation or recommendations, I think I've been overstating this. For me, it's number one, civil society actors, human rights practitioners, digital rights activists need to be able to monitor and check legislation, especially around the right to information. Do we have relevant information in line, at least with our, our aspirations and what we think is right? And especially when we're looking at Principle 4, when we're also looking at, the model law on access to information, when we're also looking at even the declaration by the African Commission on access to information, and freedom of expression. So what are the safeguards there? Article 9, we have this right, the right to access information. We're just saying we want to enjoy it as well online. And that's essentially what we're saying in Principle 4 here.
Thank you so much for that, Thobekile. And it's really great also that you're speaking before Wendy speaks on the issues of privacy, because I think one of the critical issues that you spoke about is the issue around the creation, storage, organizing, and maintenance of the information, especially around COVID-19. I'm not sure about other people, but I'm based in Harare, Zimbabwe, and when I went for my vaccine, one of the issues that was happening is that the data was being captured in physical books. So we don't know what government is going to do with that information. Are they going to collate it? Is there going to be some sort of analysis, especially if you look at some of the sensitive information that they were requesting, which is one of the issues that I was asked, is whether I live with a chronic illness. So is there going to be some research around the responses by people with chronic illnesses? So also just the importance of knowing exactly what it is that government is collecting the data for. But thank you for the emphasis on issues around maximum and proactive disclosure. I'd just like to ask the participants to, in the chat, throw and let us know whether they feel that throughout the pandemic, as we continue in the pandemic, there's been proactive or maximum disclosure around the usage, first off, just like funding that's coming in as aid for COVID-19, issues around vaccination, and also the actual vaccination processes and other information related to that. I'm just checking to see, Tobe, just hold on if there are any questions. I see Nompilo, your hand is up. You can go right ahead. I'm not seeing any other question here, but the last thing before I hand over to Nompilo is just a link and of issues that were raised by Patricia around, just the marginal communities' use of assistive technologies, or making sure that there's information going out to those communities, especially that they actually became more vulnerable during the COVID-19 period. So thank you for that. Over to you, Nompilo.
Thank you very much, Kholiwe. I just wanted to come and disclosure. I also feel it's tied into the earlier issue I highlighted around arrests based on online communication, that most of the arrests, especially during COVID-19, were relating to communication or false news or false information around COVID-19 funds or around the vaccination process, especially in South Africa, in Eswatini, and the other countries in the Southern African region. So indeed, proactive disclosure is very important to demystify some of these myths around, COVID-19, the vaccination process or the vaccine itself. So I think there's still a gap in terms of our governments being able to proactively provide information. Here in Zimbabwe, Mr. Zimbabwe had to take the government to court in February 2021, requesting for access to information on the rollout program, on the COVID-19 variant that was there in Zimbabwe, and also what was being done, even what the vaccination program would do in light of the different variants that are there. So it's quite an issue that I think still needs to be addressed And I agree with what Toregile was saying, that proactive disclosure would be key. Even with all other areas around false information, the government might be able to deal with false information without necessarily arresting people by just proactively providing information. Thank you.
Thanks for that, Nompilo. Thank you so much. And I think that one of the issues is that, or one of the things that has been noticed is that if there really is no proactive disclosure, there is likely to be a lot of misinformation. But in other circles, they feel that this is the only way you can probe governments to actually give us the information that we require. So I'm just checking my time with the host to say that we have 14 minutes to the session. For the session to end, we're going to request the 3 minutes that were taken by the technical glitch. As I introduce our final speaker this afternoon, Wendy, who is an analyst at Alt Advisory, which is a consultancy-based company, public interest company that is based in South Africa that looks particularly at human rights law, also a member of the AFDIC coalition. Wendy is going to give us the last presentation that's going to look at privacy, surveillance, and personal data protection. So over to you, Wendy.
Thank you, Kaliwe, and good afternoon, everyone. Wonderful to be here with you today, and especially with such an esteemed panel of women. So like Kaliwe said, I'm going to be giving an update on the state of affairs with regards to privacy, surveillance, and data protection in Africa, particularly over the past 2 years of the pandemic. I'm going to start with data protection because there's just been a lot of movement there recently, and the pandemic has really focused attention on the issue, as Torekile mentioned earlier. Firstly, I think we must note that there's been a whole host of data protection acts passed in the past few years, new regulatory authorities established. Just a few examples: South Africa's Protection of Personal Information Act finally came into force this year after many, many years of waiting. Zambia passed the Data Protection Act this year, 2021, and a number of draft bills have been tabled as well recently. Nigeria in 2020 and Malawi and Eswatini in 2021. So these are really promising developments in terms of advancing the state of legislation, and it continues an existing trend of the past few years. It's clear, though, that now what we really need to focus on is enforcement of these acts, getting the regulatory authorities up and running and enforcing the laws properly. We don't, unfortunately, have time to really get into many of the deficiencies of these acts in detail, but just to flag a few that we at Alt Advisory have picked up on. Firstly, I think there's this very important question, which we touched on before, about balancing access to information and data protection. In many places, we see that being abused. Just here in South Africa, since the PIA has come into force, we've heard stories of elected officials refusing to let constituents have their contact details under the guise of data protection. Anecdotally, we've heard that responses to access to information have become slower. Access to information requests, have become slower and less likely to be successful. And that obviously is not the purpose or the intent of data protection legislation, so it really needs to be addressed. Secondly, it's becoming increasingly important to think about compliance by public entities. In every country, that is the biggest sector that is processing personal information. Again, in South Africa, just because there's been so much happening here recently, the Department of Justice experienced a very big hack that compromised its IT system, with very significant implications for the operations of the courts and many other important services. None of the current data protection acts that are in force on the continent or drafts that are on the table as well fully exempt the public sector from compliance, but there is quite a large proportion of them, somewhere between kind of 20 to 40%, that have exemptions either for national security or for law enforcement or judicial functions. So I think we really need to be vigilant about how these exemptions are practiced by the public sector, and we need to hone in on securing compliance by these big public entities who are the biggest processors of personal information. Third, I want to focus on the continued need for harmonization of legislation across the continent. There really is a very wide range of protections across different countries, and this creates gaps or loopholes that can be taken advantage of, and particularly abused in the context of an emergency like COVID. It's clear that not all the existing legislation meets standards of the African Declaration. Just one example is on notifying data subjects of a breach of their data. Our analysis shows that only about 30% of countries with data protection legislation or draft legislation have an explicit requirement to notify data subjects about a breach. And so that really does compromise the data subject's ability to exercise their rights if they don't even know that they've been affected by a breach. I do think that ratifying the Malabo Convention might assist in harmonizing legislation for all its faults, and there are many, but that is a more complicated discussion to be had. It is a comprehensive standard that would advance the state of data protection in Africa if it was ratified, and I think it's something that we need to reflect on more as practitioners. Moving on to the bright side, I would say that the COVID-19 pandemic has quite radically expanded the general awareness among the public about the right to privacy through, for instance, all these very high-profile contact tracing efforts that have gone on. There is still this assumption that people, and I think it's not just in Africa, but the narrative is quite pervasive, particularly pervasive here, that people don't care about privacy and that they will happily waive it for public health reasons or other reasons. I really firmly believe that this is a destructive misunderstanding and it's a misrepresentation of how people really feel. And it's very closely connected to broader awareness about the effects of technology on our lives and the new ways in which our privacy is being compromised in the digital age. So there's definitely a need to dig into why this narrative prevails, in what ways and why do people really value their privacy, and particularly in the context of trade-offs, as the pandemic has demonstrated, where there is a need to trade off certain rights. I'll move on to surveillance now. Unfortunately, COVID tracing surveillance has continued unabated, as was described last year in the coalition's position paper, and this often happens at the expense of privacy. Just a few examples. In Nigeria, SIM card registration data was reported to have been used to identify the financial status of Nigerians and to identify if they qualified for financial aid. There were also discussions about using data sourced from bank accounts and confidential data provided to mobile networks. In Togo, it was very similar. Electoral data was actually used to target financial aid, which resulted then in people who hadn't voted being excluded from receiving aid. So the use of personal data in these contexts is obviously very concerning for many reasons, not least of which is that they may be occurring in a context of insufficient data protection regulation. There's also been growing enthusiasm for extensive use of biometric data to track and manage the public health threat in addition to other things, including the potential example for vaccine passports. There really is, I think, insufficient understanding at this point in time about how to ensure that these systems don't violate rights and are appropriately managed. A very similar issue is the use of facial recognition technology, which is picking up very quickly across the continent for various purposes. We've seen Kenya, Botswana, South Africa, and Zambia all implement facial recognition systems in public spaces in the past few years. Ostensibly, these are for fighting crime, but I think there are very serious and legitimate concerns about these systems being deployed instead to monitor political opposition or journalists or other critics. And we should also maybe be concerned about these systems being used to monitor compliance with COVID regulations, which is not, unfortunately, very far-fetched. However, on the bright side, opposition against data-driven surveillance tools is definitely growing on the global stage. A group of UN experts recently called for a moratorium on the sale and transfer of surveillance technology. Despite this, I think it's quite clear that countries in Africa are spending more and more money on surveillance technology than ever before, and there's very little regulation. There has, however, been some good precedent set in the courts on mass surveillance in particular. A good example is the RICA judgment in South Africa earlier this year, which declared aspects of the Regulation of Interception of Communications Act unconstitutional. In Zimbabwe, also the High Court granted an interdict which prevented the government implementing a police warrant seeking information on Econnet's transactions relating to two human rights organizations. So these are very promising developments, especially I think in terms of the potential for strategic litigation to continue to advance digital rights across the continent. But it is still concerning that the pace and the sophistication of surveillance just seems to perpetually accelerate, and we need regulation to really keep up with that practically. We also need to see the standards that are being set in the courts on what is appropriate, particularly with surveillance, trickle through to implementation, and in particular to regulating COVID regulation measures. I think the urgency argument is often used to exempt those measures from compliance. So we need to make sure that that's not happening unreasonably. And finally, there there's still evidence that even when you do have many of the formal protections in place against surveillance and against mass surveillance, abuses are still very common and very widespread. In South Africa, the judge that was appointed to oversee the issuing of surveillance warrants recently reported great concern at how communications were being intercepted and how those warrants were being bypassed. And that's even after the RICA judgment this year. So definitely very concerning. Conscious that I'm running out of time, I will quickly turn to my recommendations. First and foremost is to empower data protection authorities to more forcefully enforce data protection legislation that's in effect, including for the state and public entities. Like I said, there's a need to harmonize data protection legislation across Africa and eliminate loopholes. We need to take advantage of the greater awareness of the right to privacy that has been created by some of these pandemic-induced measures to inform the public and build greater support for better data protection and the defense of privacy in the online age. We definitely need greater transparency on the use of COVID-19 measures and for data protection authorities to really hold the state and telcos and other entities accountable for protecting human rights in the design and the implementation of COVID-19 mitigation. A lot is definitely still happening without proper oversight. Like I kind of hinted at before, we don't really know much about how vaccine passports will be rolled out or how they will be handled. There's a lot of biometric initiatives being rolled out, not very much transparency. My final recommendation is, unfortunately, a repeat from the position paper, which is that we really need to fully enforce the surveillance safeguards provided for in the declaration. We need better regulations against the use of new and ever-evolving surveillance technology, including its importation and including facial recognition technology. It's unfortunate that we have to repeat that recommendation because not much progress has been made. But yeah, I think if we can make progress on all those recommendations, we will be in a much better place, hopefully in a year from now. And I will leave it at that. Very happy to take questions, if we have time.
Thank you so much. Yes, we do have our 6 minutes, including the 3 that I have demanded, categorically stating that we were interrupted. But thank you so much for your interventions, Wendy, appreciating particularly the balancing, the mention of the balancing between access to information and data protection frameworks within specific aspects as we go. I haven't seen any questions yet, but I would also just want to get a sense from you in terms of just whether there are indications that the information that has been, the personal information that has been collected in response to the pandemic across the continent, whether it's being stored, electronically or otherwise, whether in terms of just like the observations that you've made in terms of this data that is being collected is specific to curbing the virus. So particularly when you look at instances around, the vaccination itself, the information that's being collected there versus the information that's being collected maybe when you go and have your tests. And then also the issue that you raised on the data protection authorities and, just like their role in the enforcement. My question to you really is in terms of just like your ratings as Alt Advisory, because I know that you have the Data Protection Africa portal as well, so might be able to respond to see the extent to which in the countries that we do have data protection authorities, they do have adequate mandate to actually oversee or enforce some of the issues or provisions within the specific legislation. So over to you, Wendy, while I scout for any other contributions.
Great, thank you, Koliwe. Big questions. I will try and answer them very quickly. First, on your question about how information is being stored and used in relation to COVID-19. I mean, I think this ties in very well with what Koliwe was saying. There's just a complete lack of information, complete lack of transparency in many, many places, which means that there's not sufficient information about how that information is being stored and how it's being used. I think this is kind of exactly gets to my point about implementation. Even though we have made enormous strides in the past few years in getting data protection legislation passed, enforcement is still falling very far behind. So in many, many places, there may even be a data protection authority, but they're not really enforcing much yet. There's very few countries, I would say maybe Mauritius is one of them, that's actually made some judgments and has actually enforced the regulations in place. So just to say that, digital rights is a very comprehensive field, and all these conversations that we've been having today really tie in, and it speaks to the importance of access to information and transparency. I would also just emphasize that all the laws that I have looked at least almost all of them, emphasize as a very core principle non-excessive collection of data. And so, this is a very important part of data protection, is making sure that data is not being collected that is not excessive and that's not unnecessary. And so that definitely raises a lot of questions in the context of pandemic management, is why is this information being collected? Is it all absolutely necessary? Why did the state need to ask you whether you had a chronic condition when you get the vaccine? At the very least, they should explain to you why that information is being collected, so that you have some agency over the decision to give up that information. In South Africa, there was luckily a pretty good example in terms of the COVID tracing apps that were developed. There was when they were announced, there was quite a big outcry with regards to how the information was going to be used, who was going to have access to it, was it going to be securely stored, and the government did actually respond to that criticism very well and adjusted a number of the kind of ways of working of the apps so that they would be more secure. So it just goes to show that this really can, if civil society, if we all play our role, we can have a positive impact on these things, and we should continue to speak up about it. Your question about data protection authorities and whether they have an adequate mandate, that is, I think, the core of the issue. One of the core issues in data protection going forward is how do we make sure that these authorities actually have the mandate and the resources to do what they need to do, which is an incredibly difficult and complicated job. I've just started kind of digging into thinking about how do we actually measure this, and how do we get a more systemic look across the continent of what needs to be done across all these data protection authorities. But a few things that stand out definitely is financial independence. So we need to look at where the funds are coming from for these authorities. Are they able to raise their own funds? Are they able to accept grants? Are they able to issue fines? I think that has an important role to play. The other thing is whether the authority is located within another department or ministry, or whether it exists as an independent entity. A lot of countries have it existing, for example, within the Ministry of Communications, which creates a lot of complications with independence. And finally, the last thing, because I know we're running out of time, is just that another thing to look at is whether the members of a data protection authority can be recalled or not, and for what reasons. Can they be fired just because they made a decision against a powerful company? That's really a problematic provision if it is the case. So that's something that we need to look at.
Thanks so much for that, Wendy. And I think those are really good insights, especially for those of us who are still in the consultative stages of our data protection laws. Those are really, really useful hints in terms of, if you do now start talking about implementation or enforcement, what is it exactly that the Data Protection Authority has a mandate to do? How independent are they, and what is their status? So I would like to thank everybody, but in particular my esteemed all-women panel, Nompilo, Patricia, Tobegile, and you, Wendy, for taking time to be part of the session, and taking time to actually go through the COVID-19 paper as well. And also to just acknowledge the presence of our rapporteur, Succeed, who will be responsible for the compilation of the final paper that we will produce and share on the Fifth Africa site. Thank you so much, everyone, for being here, and enjoy the rest of the forum. We'll definitely be meeting in some of the sessions. Thank you, and thank you to the hosts.
Thank you, everyone. Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you all. Bye.